Imagine an intelligence analyst sitting at a secure desk in Langley.
Right. Deep in the intelligence bubble.
Yeah, exactly. It's the fall of 2002. And they're looking at, satellite imagery and intercepted communications, trying to figure out if a foreign government is actively building biological weapons.
High stakes, to put it mildly.
Insanely high. So they write this heavily caveated report, and it basically says, we suspect something might be happening at this facility, but we have incredibly low confidence in the source. And then they literally list out like 5 alternative explanations.
Which is just good analytical tradecraft.
Right. But then a week later, that report gets bumped up to a mid-level supervisor, and that low confidence phrasing gets, subtly softened.
It's tweaked a little bit.
Exactly. And then a month after that, it's integrated into this broader intelligence estimate, and suddenly all those alternative explanations, they just disappear.
Completely vanished from the text.
Right. So by the time it actually lands on the president's desk, it is presented as this undeniable, rock-solid fact, a terrifying certainty.
Yeah, it really is the bureaucratic alchemy of turning a tentative guess into an absolute actionable truth. And the craziest part is it happens without anyone ever forging a document or, explicitly ordering a lie.
So today we are going to pull apart exactly how that alchemy works. We're doing a deep dive into an incredibly dense 26-year empirical research study. It's titled The Anatomy of Executive Deception.
A very heavy read, but a crucial one.
Oh, absolutely. The source material covers the years 2000 to 2026, and it documents this systemic institutional manipulation of intelligence and empirical data within United States governance. Basically, we are looking at how the highest levels of power fabricate public consensus and systematically evade oversight.
And the baseline we really need to establish right from the jump is that the misrepresentations detailed in this report, they are not spontaneous mistakes.
Right, we're not talking about like, oops, we messed up.
Exactly. We are entirely bypassing the fog of war defense here. Like when a military unit is under fire and they report the wrong location over the radio, that is an honest error born of chaos. You can't blame them for that.
Sure, that makes total sense.
But the source material we're examining today deals with calculated structural mechanisms of deception. It is about the deliberate alteration of reality by the executive branch to secure policy outcomes or, frankly, to hide massive institutional failures.
Right. And before we go one step further into this history, I really want to make an explicit promise to you listening right now, because the timeline we are looking at spans over 2 decades.
It's a lot of different leadership.
Exactly. It crosses multiple presidential administrations, totally different political parties, times of war, times of domestic crisis, and we are going to impartially unpack the documented historical findings and the empirical realities provided in this text.
Yeah, we are taking absolutely no political sides here.
None at all. Because the data points, the internal emails, the declassified memos, they don't belong to a political faction. They belong to the historical record. And our job is just to convey the actions and the cover-ups exactly as they're documented in the source.
And, if you zoom out and look at the entire 26-year continuum, the partisan labels actually become completely irrelevant.
Wait, really? Just
Yeah.
completely irrelevant?
Yeah, you literally stop seeing Republican or Democratic tactics, and you just start seeing the raw defensive reflexes of an institution. These deceptions are driven by structural incentives. It's just a feature of how the executive branch operates when its survival or its policies or its public image is acutely threatened.
Okay, I like that. So think of it like a massive corporation.
Right.
If a pharmaceutical company realizes its flagship drug has a fatal side effect, the corporate reflex, which is driven by stock prices and legal liability, is often to just bury the data, obscure the findings, rewrite the trial results.
The instinct is self-preservation.
Exactly. Now take that exact same self-preservation instinct, but apply it to the executive branch of the federal government. Only here, the stakes aren't just profit margins. The stakes are international wars, the suspension of constitutional rights, the suppression of life-saving scientific data, and, direct catastrophic impacts on public health.
And our goal with this deep dive is to give you the blueprint of that machinery. By understanding the specific, repeatable mechanisms used to manufacture these narratives, it fundamentally changes how you interact with official information.
You stop just swallowing the press release.
Right. You transition from being a passive recipient of government statements to a deeply critical consumer who actually understands the structural incentives behind the words.
Okay, so let's begin with perhaps the most consequential, life-altering action an executive branch can ever take, which is launching a preemptive war. The source material points us to the pre-war intelligence leading up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
A textbook example of narrative construction.
It really is. And the public assertions made by the administration between 2002 and 2003, they weren't vague at all. They were incredibly specific, and they were, frankly, designed to be terrifying.
Yeah, they saturated the public consciousness. I mean, the administration told the American public, and they even testified before the United Nations Security Council, that Saddam Hussein had actively reconstituted a nuclear weapons program.
Which is terrifying enough on its own.
Right, but they also asserted the existence of mobile biological weapon production facilities. They literally described them as laboratories mounted on trucks driving around the desert to evade weapons inspectors.
I vividly remember the graphics on the news. They were showing these detailed schematics of these supposed mobile labs like it was a proven fact.
And it didn't stop there. They also claimed there were massive existing stockpiles of chemical weapons.
Yeah.
And perhaps most explosively, especially in a post-9/11 environment, they stated there was a collaborative operational relationship between the Iraqi government and al-Qaeda.
Right, tying it directly to the trauma of 9/11. And they anchored all of these terrifying claims to the credibility of the U.S. intelligence apparatus. They assured the world confidently that these judgments were verified by robust human intelligence gathered right there inside the country.
But then the invasion happens, the regime falls, and the inspectors and the forensic teams actually go in to find the stockpiles.
Yeah, what would they find?
Well, the source material details the subsequent investigation by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the SSCI, alongside an independent commission. And their conclusion, after reviewing all the post-war findings, was that the pre-war judgments were just dead wrong.
Dead wrong. Not a little off, not slightly miscalculated.
Dead wrong in every conceivable metric. I mean, there was no nuclear reconstitution whatsoever. The chemical and biological stockpiles, they just didn't exist.
What about the truck labs?
The mobile biological units were a complete fabrication based on a notoriously unreliable source. And that operational relationship with al-Qaeda was entirely non-existent.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because you were telling me that the most technologically advanced, heavily funded intelligence network on the planet got every single major pillar of their assessment wrong simultaneously.
That is what the data shows, yeah.
But mathematically, that defies probability, unless, there's a thumb on the scale. So I have to ask, did someone in the Oval Office send down a memo saying, "We are going to war, forge me some evidence"?
See, that's the thing. It is far more sophisticated and, honestly, insidious than a forged document. The declassified records point to a phenomenon within the intelligence bureaucracy known as the layering effect.
The layering effect.
Right. And this is exactly what plagued the 2002 National Intelligence Estimate, or the NIE. And keep in mind, the NIE is supposed to be the gold standard. It's the consensus judgment of the entire intelligence community.
So how does the gold standard just become total fiction?
Through the compounding of unverified assumptions over time. So the layering effect works like this. An analyst makes a judgment based on a tiny, tiny fragment of unverified intelligence. Because they're professionals, they attach a long list of caveats to it. They explicitly state their doubts.
Like we talked about at the very beginning.
Exactly. But as that assessment is cited by other analysts in subsequent reports over months and years, the caveats get stripped away. It becomes a process of institutional shorthand.
Ah, I see. So the speculative guess becomes the foundational premise for the next guy's report.
You've got it. You layer a new assumption on top of the hardened old assumption. So by the time it reaches the policymakers, the uncertainty has been entirely washed out of the text.
It's a systemic erosion of doubt. The nuance is basically sacrificed for the sake of a clean executive summary.
Exactly.
But wait, even if the nuance is stripped, they still claim they had spies on the ground verifying this stuff.
And that leads to one of the most stunning empirical realities documented in the report. The intelligence community suffered from a massive structural human intelligence, or humic ante deficit.
Okay, how massive?
The declassified records reveal that after the UN inspectors left Iraq in 1998, the CIA possessed absolutely zero human sources inside the country collecting intelligence on the weapons of mass destruction target.
Wait, hang on. I want to make sure I'm hearing this correctly. For the entire 5 years leading up to the invasion, they didn't have a single person on the ground looking at these facilities.
Not one direct human asset focused on WMDs.
That is insane.
They were relying almost entirely on technical satellite photos of aluminum tubes that analysts completely misinterpreted, and highly questionable third-party defectors.
Defectors who probably had an agenda.
Oh, absolutely. Many of these defectors were provided by exile groups that had a massive vested political interest in convincing the United States to overthrow the Iraqi government.
So the foundation of the intelligence is practically non-existent. And what little there is comes from people who directly stand to gain from a war.
Right.
But the analysts had to know how thin their evidence was, right? Why would they bend the NIE so drastically? If there was no direct order to lie, why did the entire apparatus capitulate and just strip the uncertainty from their reports?
For that mechanism, we look to the Kerr Report. This is a post-mortem review led by former Deputy Director of Central Intelligence Richard Kerr, and it was declassified in 2005. The Kerr Report concluded that the administration cultivated a climate of policy-level pressure.
A climate of pressure. Okay, define that. How do you pressure an intelligence agency without giving a direct order?
By weaponizing repetitive demands for confirmation.
Okay.
So the administration made it explicitly clear what narrative they needed to justify the invasion. And they relentlessly peppered the intelligence community with questions seeking confirmation of Iraqi WMDs and links to al-Qaeda.
So they just kept asking until they got the answer they wanted.
Basically, yeah. If an analyst returned a report saying, "We found no link," the report would be kicked back. Look harder. Are you sure? What about this obscure defector's claim? When leadership repeatedly demands a specific answer, it creates this unbearable environmental pressure.
It's an intellectual siege.
That's a great way to put it. Analysts know that delivering the wrong answer means marginalization, but delivering the right answer, even if it requires cutting analytical corners and overstating thin evidence, well, that means their work gets featured in the president's daily brief.
You just keep battering the analysts with the same question until they finally give you the answer you need just to make the pressure stop.
Exactly.
So the intelligence isn't driving the policy at all. The policy is actively reshaping the intelligence to fit a predetermined mold.
And that is the mechanism. They systematically misled Congress and the public, building an unstoppable consensus for war, not through explicit forgery, but by creating an environment where the truth was a career liability and confirmation bias was rewarded.
Wow. Okay, so the executive branch successfully uses this layered, manipulated intelligence to launch the invasion. But the source material transitions here to a fascinating secondary problem.
Because starting a war is only half the battle.
Right. Once the troops cross the border, the reality on the ground inevitably diverges from those clean, sanitized projections they made in Washington. When a war starts getting ugly and public support threatens to wobble, the executive branch has to manage the battlefield narrative. They need fresh stories to sustain the momentum.
And this introduces the strategy of military public relations deployed as a tactical countermeasure. The Department of Defense realized they needed to construct stylized, emotionally resonant narratives of battlefield heroism.
Real-life action movies.
Essentially. And these aren't just feel-good stories, right? They're structural distractions. They're designed to direct public attention away from forensic realities, systemic military failures, and of course the rising human cost of the conflict.
The report highlights a glaring case study from the opening weeks of the 2003 invasion, Private First Class Jessica Lynch. And for anyone consuming media at that time, her story was inescapable.
Oh, it was everywhere. The Pentagon's narrative was meticulously crafted. On April 2, 2003, they released this highly edited, green-tinted night vision video showing Special Operations Forces raiding an Iraqi hospital in Nasiriyah to rescue her.
Very cinematic.
Very. The administration heavily promoted the story, with the president publicly praising her. The media, fed by military sources, dubbed her the little girl Rambo from the hills of West Virginia.
And the official story was just breathless. They claimed her convoy was ambushed, and instead of surrendering, she fought fiercely, firing her weapon until she was completely out of ammunition.
Like Last Stand.
Right, and they told the public she suffered multiple gunshot and stab wounds during the firefight, and that she was subsequently slapped and abused by interrogators in her hospital bed. It was framed as the ultimate cinematic story of American defiance.
And it functioned perfectly to bolster domestic morale. But when you look at the forensic assessment documented in the source material, the narrative collapses completely. The report cites the medical evaluation from Dr. Harith al-Husona, who was an Iraqi physician who actually treated her at the hospital.
And his evaluation contradicts the Pentagon.
It completely contradicts them.
Yeah.
Her injuries consisted of a broken arm, a broken thigh, and a dislocated ankle.
Which sounds like gay.
These are impact injuries entirely consistent with a high-speed vehicle crash. She did not have a single gunshot wound. She did not have a single stab wound.
That's a massive discrepancy. And Lynch herself actually confirmed this, right?
She did. In April 2007, she testified before the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. She stated on the congressional record that she was knocked unconscious when her vehicle crashed during the initial ambush. Her weapon had jammed. She never fired a single round.
Wow.
Furthermore, she completely dismantled the abuse claims. She testified that the Iraqi medical staff provided compassionate, humane care, even giving her their own blood for transfusions.
What is particularly profound about Lynch's testimony is her own reaction to being utilized as a prop. She expressed deep confusion and resentment over the fabrication. She could not fathom why the military felt the need to invent a legendary firefight when the actual tragedy of the ambush and the loss of her fellow soldiers was horrific enough.
It's the ultimate commodification of a soldier. The institution just paves over her actual terrifying human experience to create a pristine PR asset.
But this brings up a massive question for me. Why take the risk of fabricating these details? A soldier dying or being injured in a crash is already a tragedy. Why isn't the truth of their service enough?
Because the truth is often messy, morally ambiguous, and bad for recruitment and public polling. And to fully understand the extreme lengths the institution will go to protect a politically useful narrative, we really have to examine the second case study in the report.
The Pat Tillman case.
Yes. This one involves an active, synchronized multi-agency cover-up, the death of Corporal Patrick Tillman in 2004.
The cultural weight of Pat Tillman at the time cannot be overstated. He famously walked away from a highly lucrative NFL contract to enlist as an Army Ranger following the September 11 attacks. He was the literal poster child for American sacrifice.
And in April 2004, the military announced he had been killed in action in a canyon ambush in Mana, Afghanistan.
And the initial official report stated he died during a heroic countercharge against enemy combatants.
Right, that's what they said. The military posthumously awarded him the Silver Star, cementing this narrative of ultimate glorious sacrifice.
But the historical and forensic reality laid out in this report is devastating. He was not killed by enemy combatants. He was killed by friendly fire.
Yeah.
He was shot by his own men. And the most damning part, the military command structure knew almost immediately.
That is a critical distinction to make. This was not a situation where the fog of war obscured the facts for months. The chain of command was aware of the fratricide within days, and the institutional response was not to inform the family or correct the record. It was to initiate an aggressive cover-up to preserve the myth.
And the specific details of this cover-up are chilling, because they didn't just write a misleading report. Officers on the ground actively destroyed physical evidence. They burned Tillman's blood-soaked uniform and his body armor to hide the ballistic evidence that would prove he was shot by American weapons.
It's horrific. And the deception permeated every level of command. Lieutenant General Philip Kensinger provided highly misleading testimony regarding when he learned the true nature of the death. Brigadier General Stanley McChrystal was later held accountable for processing the Silver Star paperwork containing inaccurate assertions about enemy fire, despite knowing the likelihood of fratricide.
But the absolute darkest mechanical detail of this cover-up involves the eyewitnesses. Military officers directly ordered Specialist Brian O'Neill, who was in the canyon, pinned down right next to Tillman when the fatal shots were fired by their own squad, to lie to Tillman's family.
Unbelievable.
They commanded him to falsify his eyewitness account. They forced a traumatized soldier to look a grieving family in the eye and lie about how their son died.
And the administration deliberately delayed notifying the family of the friendly fire investigation for 35 days. They sat on the truth for over a month.
Why? 35 days is an incredibly specific delay. A cover-up that involves burning evidence and forcing witnesses to lie requires immense coordination. What was happening in the spring of 2004 that made the executive branch so desperate to keep the Tillman myth alive that they would risk a massive scandal?
You have to look at the synchronized timeline. The administration delayed the truth specifically to allow a nationally televised memorial service for Tillman to proceed under the false pretenses of a heroic enemy engagement.
Okay, but why did they need that memorial so badly?
Because they needed that memorial service to dominate the national news cycle. At that exact moment in April 2004, the explosive photos of the Abu Ghraib torture scandal were leaking to the press.
Oh, wow. So Abu Ghraib is breaking, showing these horrifying human rights abuses by American personnel, which threatens to completely derail public support for the global war on terror?
Precisely. The institution was staring down a catastrophic public relations disaster. They desperately needed an unsullied, unifying hero to act as a counterweight in the media ecosystem. Tillman was incredibly valuable to the administration as a symbol, and the truth of a friendly fire death would have only added to the narrative of military incompetence and chaos surrounding Abu Ghraib.
The coordination required to pull that off is staggering.
It was immense. The source material documents that subsequent congressional investigations discovered at least 97 White House officials were actively exchanging hundreds of emails regarding Tillman's death in the days immediately following the incident.
97 officials coordinating on a single casualty.
Yes, but here's the real mechanism of concealment. The moment the friendly fire reality was officially confirmed and leaked to the press, all written communications among those 97 officials regarding the actual cause of his death miraculously and completely ceased.
Just dead silence.
It was a synchronized, strategic effort at the highest echelons of government to deploy a counter-narrative, and then a synchronized effort to shut down the paper trail when the narrative collapsed.
The tragedy of the individual soldier is completely secondary to the survival of the policy. If reality fails to provide a hero to drown out a scandal, the institution will manufacture one, even if it means burning the uniform and threatening the survivors.
It demonstrates that the reflex for narrative control is absolute. And as the source material tracks this timeline, we see that this institutional reflex for total secrecy and manipulation did not remain confined to foreign battlefields.
Right. It comes home.
It turned inward. The same mechanisms used to shield the war effort were deployed domestically, targeting the very citizens the government is chartered to protect.
Which brings us to a massive shift in the landscape, the domestic surveillance shield. After 9/11, the national security apparatus expanded exponentially. The government began collecting vast amounts of data, but the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution strictly protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. So how does the executive branch reconcile a massive, secret domestic spying apparatus with a public that demands civil liberties?
They reconcile it through deception. They deliberately mislead Congress and the public to shield highly sensitive and frankly legally dubious programs from constitutional scrutiny. The objective is to prevent the public from ever gaining the standing to challenge the programs in court.
Let's examine the presidential deception documented in 2004. President George W. Bush travels to Buffalo, New York to deliver a public address specifically aimed at reauthorizing the Patriot Act. He knows the public is anxious about government overreach. He stands at the podium, looks into the cameras, and issues a definitive reassurance. He says, anytime you hear the United States government talking about wiretap, it requires a court order. Nothing has changed, by the way.
It is an unequivocal, absolute statement designed to put the public at ease. But the declassified reality, which broke open in late 2005, revealed a staggering constitutional bypass.
Because it wasn't true.
Not at all.
Yeah.
2 years prior to that speech in Buffalo in 2002, President Bush had signed a highly classified executive order. This order explicitly authorized the National Security Agency, the NSA, to conduct warrantless surveillance of international telephone and internet communications originating or terminating inside the United States.
Let's clarify how massive that is. They were actively, deliberately bypassing the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The FISA court was established specifically after the spying scandals of the 1970s to act as a secret judicial referee. It ensures the government has probable cause before tapping an American's phone, and the executive branch simply bypassed it entirely while simultaneously assuring the public that court orders were still an absolute requirement.
They utilized the classification system not just to protect intelligence sources from foreign adversaries, but as an information shield against their own citizens. They classified the program to prevent a public democratic debate on a fundamental constitutional issue.
But the report shows this pattern of domestic deception didn't stop there. It became deeply entrenched in the intelligence bureaucracy. Almost a decade later, we see this mechanism deployed again, under oath, by the highest intelligence officer in the country. March 12, 2013.
Yes. This is a testimony of James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence. He is sitting before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Senator Ron Wyden, who is a member of the committee, asks him a highly specific pointed question regarding domestic spying. He asks, does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
And Clapper's response is brief and categorical. He says, no, sir, not wittingly.
Right. And then, 3 months later, a former NSA contractor named Edward Snowden leaks a massive trove of highly classified documents to the global press. And among the most explosive revelations is the existence of the Section 215 Mass Telephony Metadata Collection Program.
Under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, the NSA was engaging in the bulk, indiscriminate daily collection of call detail records. They weren't listening to the audio of the calls, but they were vacuuming up the metadata, who you called, when you called, and for exactly how long.
Which tells them plenty.
Oh, everything. And they were doing this to millions of American citizens every single day. It was the exact specific program that Clapper had just testified did not exist.
When Clapper was confronted with the Snowden leaks, the institutional defense mechanisms kicked in. He issued a formal apology, describing his testimony as clearly erroneous. But in subsequent public interviews, his defense was incredibly revealing about the bureaucratic mindset. He claimed his answer was the least untruthful response he could provide, given the constraints of classification.
The least untruthful response. That phrase alone is an anatomy of deception. You parse the language so thinly that you can technically justify lying to an oversight committee.
He attempted to argue that his mind was focused on Section 702 of FISA, which targets the content of foreign communications, rather than the Section 215 program, which targeted domestic metadata.
But the source material absolutely demolishes that defense. Congressional records show that Senator Wyden's office did not spring this question on Clapper by surprise. They sent the exact phrasing of the question to the director's office 24 hours in advance of the hearing.
You had a whole day to prepare.
Yes. Clapper had a full day to consult with his lawyers, review the programs, and determine exactly how to answer. He didn't just get flustered on the stand. It was a premeditated calculation to provide a false answer to Congress. And even after the hearing, his staff refused opportunities to correct the official public record.
Which brings us to the most concerning structural element of this entire event, the systemic failure of congressional oversight. The problem extends far beyond a single intelligence director providing false testimony. The Senate Intelligence Committee, including Senator Wyden, knew the statement was unequivocally false the moment Clapper said it in the hearing room.
Because they had been briefed on it.
Exactly. They'd been briefed on the Section 215 program in a classified setting.
Wait, so the committee tasked with holding the intelligence agencies accountable watched him lie under oath, knew he was lying, and did absolutely nothing.
They permitted the deception to stand in the public record. The institution prioritized the strict classification of the surveillance program over their fundamental democratic obligation to maintain an honest dialogue with the electorate. They became complicit in the shield.
And the legal consequences reflect that complicity. The watchdog group Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, known as CRUW, aggressively pushed the Department of Justice to prosecute Clapper. They argued he clearly violated federal false statement and obstruction statutes. And what was the result?
The Department of Justice brought 0 charges. The institution insulates itself.
Hiding surveillance programs behind the wall of national security is the classic cloak and dagger justification. It is an argument about protecting methods and sources. But the source material forces us to look at an even more dangerous application of this mechanism. What happens when the executive branch uses these same tactics of manipulation and suppression, not against terrorists or spies, but against domestic scientific data?
The stakes get incredibly visceral.
Exactly. What happens when the facts being altered concern immediate physical threats to public safety?
We are moving into the subversion of science and crisis reality. The premise here is devastatingly simple when empirical scientific data threatens a political objective, or when an unfolding crisis contradicts a narrative already established by a leader. Federal agencies are structurally pressured to alter findings and ignore internal warnings. They sacrifice public safety to protect the administration from political fallout.
The first example in the text is a tragedy that still reverberates today, the 9/11 Ground Zero air quality crisis.
On September 13, 2001, just 2 days after the World Trade Center towers collapsed, creating an unprecedented cloud of pulverized building materials, EPA Administrator Christine Todd Whitman told reporters that the agency had not seen any readings indicating a health hazard. On September 18th, the EPA issued a formal press release reassuring the public that the ambient air in Lower Manhattan was safe to breathe.
The images from those weeks are burned into the cultural memory. You had thousands of people, first responders, construction workers, local residents walking around the rubble, many without industrial respirators, trying to clear the site and reopen the financial district. They did this because the federal government explicitly told them it was safe.
But the source material details an August 2003 investigation by the EPA's own internal watchdog, the Office of the Inspector General, or OIG.
And the OIG findings are a masterclass in executive subversion.
They really are. The investigation revealed that the EPA's public assurances of safety were made without sufficient, reliable scientific data. And more importantly, it documented direct interference from the White House. The White House Council on Environmental Quality, the CEQ, actively pressured the EPA to delete cautionary information from their press releases.
They didn't just spin the data, they literally edited the science. The report documents that CEQ officials pressured the EPA to change references to specific asbestos levels. The actual environmental samples taken at ground zero showed asbestos levels that were double, and in some cases triple, the EPA's own established safety thresholds.
But admitting that the air was highly toxic conflicted with the administration's overriding political and economic objective, which was to project resilience and get Wall Street reopened immediately. So under pressure, the EPA edited the text to describe the asbestos levels as merely slightly above the limit.
Just slightly above. They also deleted explicit warnings advising local residents to have their homes professionally cleaned to remove toxic dust, replacing them with vague, generic instructions to just follow local guidelines.
The consequence of prioritizing economic optics over empirical environmental data is catastrophic. Over 7,000 first responders, rescue workers, and Lower Manhattan residents have suffered long-term debilitating health crises, including severe respiratory diseases and multiple forms of cancer directly linked to their exposure to toxic asbestos, pulverized glass, lead, and high pH levels at the site.
They sacrificed the lungs of the people digging through the rubble to protect a narrative of immediate recovery. It is a terrifying subversion of epistemic authority, and we see this exact same dynamic play out again during one of the worst natural disasters in American history, Hurricane Katrina in 2005.
When the levees broke and New Orleans flooded, resulting in a horrific loss of life and a chaotic, delayed federal response, the administration faced a massive political crisis. To deflect responsibility for the lack of preparation, President Bush appeared on television and stated, "Nobody anticipated the breach of the levees." He framed the disaster as an unpredictable, unavoidable act of nature that overwhelmed the system.
But the historical records, specifically declassified transcripts and video footage of top-level emergency briefings held before the storm hit, proves that statement was entirely false. On August 28, the day before Katrina made landfall, FEMA Director Michael Brown conducted a video briefing with President Bush and Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff.
During that briefing, Brown explicitly and repeatedly warned the president. He stated clearly that Katrina was a massive storm that could breach the New Orleans levee system and put countless lives at risk. The empirical meteorological threat was directly communicated to the highest level of the executive branch.
Yet, despite that direct warning, they failed to preposition adequate federal relief or deploy massive search and rescue assets before the storm hit. And when the political fallout began, they simply denied the warnings existed. Furthermore, according to Brown's later congressional testimony in 2007, the White House engaged in targeted political retribution. He testified that the administration purposely delayed federalizing the emergency response in Louisiana in order to shift the public blame onto the state's Democratic governor, Kathleen Blanco.
They weaponized the emergency response timeline for partisan defense. They ignored the scientific warnings, failed to act, and then attempted to rewrite the historical record to protect their own political viability.
Which leads perfectly into an incident that, on the surface, feels almost absurd, but actually reveals how deeply this reflex to alter science has penetrated the bureaucracy. It's the event commonly referred to as Sharpiegate during Hurricane Dorian in 2019.
It is a textbook example of an institution contorting empirical data to protect the ego and public statements of the executive. On September 4, President Trump posted a tweet claiming that Hurricane Dorian was projected to hit the state of Alabama much harder than initially anticipated.
The problem was, the actual National Hurricane Center forecast models definitively showed the storm was tracking up the Atlantic coast. Alabama was not in danger. Recognizing that a presidential tweet could cause unwarranted panic and unnecessary evacuations, the Birmingham National Weather Service office immediately did its job. They issued a public correction on social media, assuring residents that Alabama would see no impacts from the storm.
In a functioning system, the meteorological science dictates the public warning, but the White House refused to let the president's incorrect tweets stand as an error. Several days later, during an Oval Office briefing, the administration displayed a modified National Hurricane Center forecast map. The official graphic had been manually altered with a black marker as Sharpie to artificially extend the storm's cone of uncertainty over southern Alabama.
It seems almost conical, drawing on a weather map. But the bureaucratic fallout behind the scenes was severe. When the professional meteorologists stood by their actual data, political appointees at the Department of Commerce and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, intervened to suppress the science.
Yet NOAA published a highly unusual unsigned public statement that validated the president's false claim and actively rebuked the Birmingham office for issuing their accurate correction.
Unbelievable.
Subsequent independent investigations, including one by the National Academy of Public Administration, led by Admiral Thad Allen, and another by the Commerce Department Inspector General, mapped out the coercion. The investigations confirmed that NOAA's acting administrator, Neil Jacobs, along with other political appointees, explicitly violated the agency's strict scientific integrity policies. They issued the rebuke under direct, intense pressure from the White House and the Commerce Secretary.
Let me throw an analogy at you to clarify the danger here. Imagine a hospital administrator going into a patient's medical chart and changing a diagnosis of a highly contagious, severe disease to the common cold. They do this because a severe disease outbreak looks terrible for the hospital's public relations and funding. The physical reality of the disease hasn't changed. The virus is still there. But by altering the data, the administrator has made it impossible for the doctors to treat the patient and impossible for the public to protect themselves.
That is a highly accurate representation of the mechanism. When you corrupt the data at the source to serve a political master, the entire system of public safety breaks down. We see this mechanism applied not just to weather and environment, but to diplomatic security crises as well, such as the intense narrative management following the 2012 attack on the U.S. diplomatic post in Benghazi, Libya.
This attack resulted in the tragic deaths of Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other Americans. The timing is critical here. This happened in September 2012, in the final, highly volatile months of a presidential election campaign. The Obama administration was running on a record of having decimated al-Qaeda and stabilized the region. A coordinated terrorist attack on a consulate fundamentally threatened that core campaign narrative.
The administration immediately needed to manage the public perception of the attack. On the Sunday morning news programs following the incident, Ambassador Susan Rice, utilizing talking points provided by the intelligence community, informed the public that the attack was a spontaneous reaction to protests in Cairo over an anti-Islamic web video. It was framed as an unpredictable riot that spun out of control.
But the empirical reality emerging from the ground was entirely different. Declassified investigations by the SSCI and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence demonstrated that the people actually experiencing the event knew immediately it was not a spontaneous protest. On September 15th, the CIA's chief of station in Tripoli sent a definitive email to top agency officials in Washington. The email explicitly stated that the events were, quote, not an escalation of protests.
The personnel on the ground recognized it as a coordinated armed assault. But back in Washington, a fierce interagency bureaucratic struggle was occurring over the drafting of the official talking points that would be given to Congress and the press. Declassified internal emails revealed that the CIA's original drafts on September 14 specifically referred to suspected participation by Islamic extremists, noted possible links to al-Qaeda, and cited previous CIA warnings about extremist threats in Benghazi.
But the State Department, which was responsible for the security of the consulate, objected vehemently to those facts being included. State Department spokesperson Victoria Nuland complained in emails that if the talking points acknowledged prior warnings and al-Qaeda involvement, members of Congress would use those facts to brutally criticize the State Department for ignoring the threat environment.
The institutional reflex to avoid blame overrode the need for an accurate public accounting. Under intense pressure from the State Department and White House political advisors, the references to al-Qaeda, previous security warnings, and the extremist group Ansar al-Sharia were systematically scrubbed from the final talking points. They deleted the most critical contextual facts to construct a politically palatable narrative of a spontaneous, unpredictable protest.
If we pull back and connect all 4 of these massive events, the EPA altering asbestos levels at ground zero, FEMA shifting blame during Katrina, NOAA suppressing weather models during Dorian, and the State Department scrubbing intelligence after Benghazi, the underlying structural mechanism is identical. It is the deliberate subversion of epistemic authority.
Exactly.
The literal empirical reality of the air we breathe, the storms that threaten our coasts, and the security of our diplomats is bent, edited, and erased to serve the immediate political survival of the executive branch.
It demonstrates that the institution will consistently prioritize narrative control over factual transparency, regardless of the physical danger it creates or the long-term damage it inflicts on public trust.
We have spent the last 50 minutes exploring how facts are twisted for PR, suppressed to hide surveillance, and altered for political survival. But the source material indicates that this institutional machinery of suppression reaches its absolute darkest, most extreme point when the government is attempting to hide its most profound moral compromises from history itself. This brings us to the final section of our dive: deceptive interrogation and torture.
We are examining the post-9/11 CIA program, known officially as Enhanced Interrogation Techniques, or the EIT program. This was a sprawling, highly classified global system of secret detention facilities, proxy renditions, and coercive interrogation designed to extract actionable intelligence from suspected terrorists.
To understand the depth of the deception, we first have to look at the promises the CIA made to get the program authorized. They had to convince the Department of Justice, congressional oversight committees, and eventually the public that this unprecedented departure from international law was justified.
They had a lot of selling to do.
Yeah. They assured policymakers that the program was safe and tightly medically monitored. They claimed it was strictly legal under newly drafted memos. They promised it was being managed by highly experienced, language-fluent intelligence professionals. And the ultimate justification, the core argument, was that it was highly effective. They explicitly claimed that the use of these brutal techniques had directly thwarted at least 20 major catastrophic terrorist attacks.
Those were the foundational assertions that allowed the program to exist. But in December 2014, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence finally released the declassified executive summary of their exhaustive torture report. The findings of that report completely and systematically shattered every single claim the CIA had made. The reality documented was a sophisticated, poorly managed system of state-sanctioned torture.
The details provided in this report are incredibly grim, and they are difficult to discuss, but we have to look at the mechanics of what was actually happening versus what was claimed. The report identifies 119 men who were subjected to this secret program, and the medical atrocities committed under the guise of safe, monitored techniques are staggering.
The report details the use of rectal rehydration and rectal feeding. At least 5 men, including high-profile detainees like Abu Zubaydah, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Majid Khan, and Marwan al-Jabur, were subjected to this procedure. Crucially, the investigators explicitly noted that these procedures were performed without any documented medical necessity. It was not a health intervention. It was a method of total behavioral control and degradation.
The physical trauma inflicted was severe and lasting. The report documents the case of another detainee, Mustafa al-Hassawi, who was diagnosed with chronic hemorrhoids, an anal fissure, and symptomatic rectal prolapse. The SSCI investigators indicated these injuries were the direct result of excessive punitive force used during custodial examinations. Other detainees, such as Abdalrahim al-Nashiri, were subjected to psychological torture via mock executions. Interrogators threatened him with a firearm and, in a horrifying display of unchecked power, actually revved a power drill next to his hooded head to simulate an impending execution.
And contrary to the claims of strict medical safety, the program was legal. In November 2002, CIA interrogators operating at a secret facility known as Cobalt killed a detainee named Gul Rahman. They left him shackled to a wall on a freezing concrete floor, wearing only a sweatshirt. He died of hypothermia.
A man freezes to death, shackled to a wall, and what is the institutional response? The most shocking detail to me in this entire section of the text is the bureaucratic reaction to his death. No CIA employees were formally disciplined. No one was prosecuted. In fact, the officer who managed that specific black site, a site the report notes was essentially unmanaged and chaotic, was later recommended for a cash award of $2,500 for his consistently superior work.
It completely upends the claim of professional oversight. And the report also dismantles the claim that the program was run by experienced, language-fluent professionals. The documentation reveals that the CIA heavily outsourced the violence. The program was largely designed and implemented by external private contractors, 2 psychologists who formed a company that was paid $81 million. Contractors were paid up to $1,800 a day to conduct interrogations, and many of these individuals had absolutely zero prior interrogation experience or relevant cultural or linguistic background.
Okay, so the program is brutal, it's run by untrained contractors, and it's lethal. But this brings us to the ultimate question of utility. The classic Hollywood defense of torture the Jack Bauer scenario is the ticking time bomb. Did the CIA at least extract the vital, life-saving intelligence they claimed justified breaking international law? Did they stop the 20 attacks?
The empirical answer provided by the SSCI report is no, they did not. The committee's exhaustive review of millions of pages of the CIA's own internal cables and databases proved that the agency systematically lied about the efficacy of the program. The 20 most frequent claims of thwarted attacks, which the CIA used to justify the program to the President and Congress, were found to be completely fabricated or fundamentally wrong.
They fabricated the success rate to keep the funding and the legal cover.
Entirely. Furthermore, the committee discovered that key foundational intelligence that the CIA claimed was obtained through torture, such as the critical information leading to the capture of 9/11 architect Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, was actually acquired through standard, non-coercive FBI rapport-building interviews before the detainees were ever transferred to the torture program. The report notes that when subjected to the extreme pain of the EITs, detainees routinely fabricated intelligence, providing false plots and names just to make the immediate suffering stop, which sent the intelligence community on massive resource-draining wild goose chases.
So we have to look at the massive liability here. They lied to the Justice Department to get legal approval. They outsourced the torture of 119 men to untrained contractors. They killed a detainee and rewarded the site manager. They acquired no unique, actionable intelligence that couldn't be obtained elsewhere. And then they lied to the entire government about stopping 20 major attacks. The internal panic must have been absolute. How does a bureaucracy even begin to cover up a failure of that magnitude?
You covered it up by actively corrupting the highest channels of information flow in the government. The source material details how the CIA repeatedly inserted false and exaggerated information regarding the program's successes into the president's daily brief. They aggressively overruled internal protests from their own officers, seasoned personnel, who warned headquarters that the program was a legal, moral, and operational disaster. They actively impeded internal inspector general reviews, and they deliberately misled congressional oversight committees about the severity of the techniques and the conditions of confinement.
But the ultimate structural attempt at subversion, the final move to erase this from history, happens after the investigation is complete. The SSCI spends years compiling this massive 6,700-page definitive report detailing all these crimes and failures. They released the 500-page executive summary to the public in 2014. What happens next?
In 2015, control of the Senate changes hands, and the new SSCI chairman, Richard Burr, attempts an unprecedented bureaucratic clawback. He sent formal requests to all executive branch agencies, the CIA, the DOJ, the DOD, demanding that they locate and return every single copy of the full 6,700-page unredacted report back to the Senate.
Why demand the physical copies back? What is the mechanical advantage of holding all the copies in the Senate vault?
It is deliberate exploitation of public records law. Under the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, the public and journalists can sue executive branch agencies to release documents. However, congressional records are legally exempt from FOIA. By pulling every copy of the report out of executive agency files and transferring ownership back to the Senate, Burr was attempting to construct an impenetrable legal shield. The goal was to ensure that the full granular details of the CIA's torture program could never be acquired by human rights groups or historians through FOIA lawsuits. It was a structural attempt to legally erase the evidence from the public domain forever.
We need to take a collective breath here. We have covered an immense, staggering amount of historical ground. We have looked at 26 years of data. We've examined how the intelligence community stripped caveats to fabricate WMD evidence in Iraq. We've seen the military PR machine invent battlefield heroes like Jessica Lynch and cover up the friendly fire death of Pat Tillman. We've watched the NSA bypass the FISA courts to spy on Americans while the Director of National Intelligence lied to Congress. We've seen the White House alter EPA asbestos data and NOAA hurricane maps. And we've documented the CIA torturing detainees and attempting to legally erase the evidence. We have looked at the mechanics. What is the overarching conclusion we draw from this anatomy?
The grand conclusion is that these events are not isolated errors, and they are not the work of a few malicious individuals. Based on the empirical review of this quarter century, we can synthesize 4 core pillars of institutional deception. These are the structural mechanisms the executive branch consistently deploys when it needs to control reality. First, classification as an information shield. The government utilizes the secrecy apparatus not primarily to hide methods from foreign enemies, but to conceal illegal domestic programs and preemptively shut down constitutional debate among its own citizens.
That is the NSA warrantless wiretapping and Director Clapper's least untruthful testimony.
Exactly. Second, analytical layering and the stripping of uncertainty. Bureaucracies routinely remove caveats and doubts from intelligence streams, slowly hardening speculative guesses into uncontestable facts to manufacture consensus for massive policy shifts, like a preemptive war.
That is the Iraqi WMD National Intelligence Estimate.
Third, the subversion of scientific and epistemic authority. When hard empirical reality contradicts political objectives or public statements, the institution applies direct pressure to alter the science, actively eroding public trust in expert agencies.
The EPA at Ground Zero, FEMA during Katrina, and the NOAA Sharpie incident.
And the fourth pillar, the strategic deployment of counter-narratives. The executive branch manufactures highly stylized emotional distractions such as cinematic battlefield heroism, specifically to hide systemic failures and manage public perception during periods of crisis.
The fabricated rescues and the covered-up friendly fire. So here is the ultimate takeaway, and I want to speak directly to you, listener, right now. Why does this exhaustive 26-year history of bureaucratic maneuvering matter to your life today? You should care because the cost of this deception is not just historical. The cost is not just the tragic, unnecessary loss of life in the Iraq War or the thousands of sick 9/11 first responders, as horrific as those realities are. The true compounding cost is the profound corrosion of the relationship between you and your government.
When an institution systematically prioritizes narrative control over factual transparency, it actively degrades the entire foundation of a democratic society. It fosters a deep, pervasive cynicism where citizens assume everything is a lie, which is equally as dangerous as believing everything is the truth.
Informed self-governance is physically impossible if the information you are given is manufactured. You cannot vote effectively, you cannot advocate for policies, and you cannot protect your community if the realities of war, the scope of domestic surveillance, and the immediate threats to public health are structurally hidden from you or altered to protect a politician's ego.
A democratic system requires a shared baseline of reality. Knowledge is only valuable when it is grounded in empirical truth. When the truth is treated by the government as a liability to be managed rather than a duty to be upheld, the mechanisms of accountability completely break down.
Think back to the analogy of the hospital administrator altering the patient's chart. If the institutions designed to collect the facts and diagnose the problems in our society have structural, historical incentives to manipulate the truth for their own survival, how do we ever cure the disease? I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today. Think about the news cycle. Think about the official government press releases or statements you consume this week. If the executive branch is structurally wired to protect itself at the expense of the truth, how do we as citizens design and build oversight institutions that are actually incentivized to be honest? How do we force transparency when the truth makes the powerful look terrible? It's the most vital question we face, and the answer requires all of us to stay deeply, critically engaged.